So hello everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Kashyap Challapalli, and today I'm going to present to you my senior project, a web app venture fortune. So a little bit about me. So my name is Kashyap, and I'm a senior at Grandview High School. I've been coding for 3 years now, and I've taken all 3 of the coding classes here at Grandview High School: AP Computer Science A, AP Computer Principles, and Intro to Programming. I was heavily involved in the business clubs FBLA and DECA, and I was also a member of TSA. And I'm planning to major in computer science and econ at the CU Boulder. Okay, so my inspiration for this project comes in 2 aspects. So one of them was that I've had 2 areas of interest that I've tried to cultivate throughout high school, and those are finance and technology, which can further be specified into investments and computer science. And the second aspect was that last summer I did an internship at an alternate asset portfolio advisory company. So essentially what they did was they advised customers, clients on what combination of investments would best fit in their portfolios in order to get the most rate of return on whatever they invested in. So basically how to get the most money back. And I wanted to create, and it was really hard to learn about investments because I had to look on various sources. A lot of them had a lot of unnecessary details that I didn't even need, and it was just really annoying in general. And I wanted to create something that would facilitate learning all of this and getting started in investments in general. And this resulted in the creation of Venture Fortune. So my project description comes down to 2 things. My project has 2 essential functions. One is tracking and one is education. So the education function is basically all of my research and the more important things that I researched. For example, I used a bunch of YouTube videos, I used a bunch of trusted websites, and all of that research compiles into what my actual education aspect is. And for my tracking aspect, I made a data entry form, where a user can put in their data and what their name is, what their age is, etc., in order to make sure that they can get a data visualization at the end. And yeah, the data visualization is through charts that comes from the user data entry form. Okay, so these were my objectives at the beginning of the year. So I wanted to gain a higher understanding of JavaScript, Python, Java, C++, and develop my programming skills to the max. What actually ended up happening on that aspect is I did learn a lot of JavaScript and 2 other coding languages called HTML and CSS, but I had experience with Python and Java, but I couldn't really develop those further, just because this project, what I ended up doing, didn't really require all 3 of them. And C++ I couldn't touch at all because it didn't require any C++ at all in my final product. I also wanted to gain a very intricate and solid understanding of how investments work, which I did end up doing through all the research I did and all the education aspect of that. And I wanted to be able to make money from this app and potentially develop it even further and further. And as of this present moment, I do plan on developing it a lot further, but I don't expect to make any money for this app right now. And I wanted to gain experience in building apps and working with software and web development in general. And I did achieve that objective because this app was basically entirely just web development, since it was a web application. So I did achieve that goal. And I also wanted to be able to speak in front of large audiences, build my communication skills, time management skills, etc. I was able to build a bunch of time management skills, but the actual presenting in front of crowds and everything, that was cut due to COVID. So this is my project logo. So it's basically a green circle with an upward arrow and then a pile of coins laying next to it. So the green represents balance, wealth, and abundance. The gray represents unpredictability, and it contrasted really well with the green. It just looked visually appealing. The arrow represented an upwards trajectory, which is what I wanted my app to signify. And the coins represented just money and capital and wealth in general. Okay. So for my advisory list, they can be divided into 2 categories. They were my expert advisors and my support advisors. So my expert advisor was my dad, Roger Challapalli, and he's a software engineer with 20 years of experience, and he's an embedded architect over at CenturyLink, and he has a bunch of experience with web development, and he helped me tremendously throughout this project. My support advisors were two of my good friends, Subhankar Mohanty and C.D. Raja. Sub is a sophomore at CU Boulder, and he's majoring in computer science right now. And CB is an incoming freshman at Harvard, and he's planning to major in computer science. Okay, so this is where my project actually started. So this is a brief run through of what I'm actually going to be talking about and the different components of how I made my project. So the app had many parts to it, but these were the main ones. So it was made possible through the use of something called Firebase, which I'll explain. And the main parts of building the web app were four things: authentication, database, education, and charts. And visualization encompasses all of those things. And I did all this through Bootstrap, which is essentially a coding library, which is just a bunch of pre-written code that you can use in order to make your life a whole lot easier. And I encountered many problems throughout this, which I'll talk about, and the main part of my research that I had to put into was learning web development from scratch. Okay, so this was my timeline. So everything in the bold is what I initially planned to do, and everything below that is what actually ended up happening. So at the beginning in December, so before December it was all ideation and actually deciding on how to do it, what the best course of action was, etc. And I didn't actually start developing it until December. In December was when I wanted to finish the ideation stage, design everything, and start back-end web development. So back-end web development, just for some context, is essentially how the computer communicates to web servers and how it communicates with the internet and connects with the internet. And there's something else called front-end web development, which is essentially just what we see in a web app and how it looks and all the visualization of it. And what actually ended up happening was back-end development didn't happen because I decided to use Firebase. I'll explain further on what Firebase is, but essentially right now, Firebase is a platform that took care of all of the back-end development. And in January, what I wanted to do was finish all of the back-end development, which didn't happen. And I wanted to finish my mid-year presentation, the authentication, and start thinking about the front end and how the app would actually look and start coding all of that. And Firebase took care of the back end. And authentication took a lot longer than expected, which was probably one of the hardest parts of the project. And in February, I wanted to use packaging framework, decide on a front-end framework, which a framework essentially is the same thing. It's just a bunch of pre-written code that helps make your life a whole lot easier, and packaging tools. And I ended up doing none of this. But I did focus on the front end, but I didn't use any frameworks. And I made all of the visualization and made and coded all of it manually by myself. In March, I wanted to set up a server page application. I wanted to make my database. I wanted to look at, and essentially at the beginning, I was thinking I would use Firebase only for my database and hosting. Hosting is when you throw your app or web app up on the computer so you can access it from anywhere, which is when you put it on the internet. And what I actually ended up happening was I used no server page applications, and I focused only on making a data entry form where the users could put in all of their data for the investment tracking aspect, and using the database, and I connected that with authentication. And in April, my initial plan was just to focus on the final presentation, but what I actually did was I made the charts and data visualization aspect of it, and used Chart.js, which is another JavaScript library, and connected all of those separate pages through HTML, and finally finished up making the interface and the actual app. And I made the final presentation, which you're listening to right now. Okay, so Firebase is probably the biggest part of this app and what made all of this possible. So essentially what Firebase is, it's just a platform to develop apps. So you can make web apps, you can make anything. You can make iOS apps, you can make Android apps, just in general. Any type of app, and it's a very good platform for development in that space, and it's made by Google. And Firebase is a backend as a service, which means it takes care of all the backend and how the computer communicates with the internet. And I used authentication database, and I'm planning on using hosting through Firebase, and it has really well written documentation, which is essentially just a bunch of things that explain what each function in Firebase is, how to use it, and how to sync it with your code. And it has a lot of SDKs, which means software developer kits, and those are just a bunch of pre-written code. And it's easy to use if you know how to do it. which I didn't at the beginning, and that led to a lot of problems. Okay, so this is the code for Firebase. So I can't really explain all the actual code. I can't really explain like all the details, but essentially what this part does, every part that's in the red circle, it's basically how I installed Firebase. It's the code that's needed in order to let your code communicate with Firebase, and let Firebase know that this is the software that we're going to use. This is the software that's going to communicate and show up in the database. And this is the console of Firebase, which is essentially just the Firebase homepage. Okay, so now authentication, which is one of the two big parts of the app. So authentication is basically just how you identify users. So when, for example, when you log into something, it's, for example, if I would log into something, it would be my username would be Kashyap Challapalli, and my password would be 123456. That's a form of sign-in, and that's essentially what authentication is. The authentication methods I use are sign in and create a new account, which every app or every website or just in general everything has. And I use sign in with Google. I added that on additionally. And I did my authentication through Firebase. And I did an installation through something called script tags, which essentially allow whatever your software is, whatever your software that you're coding on is, to communicate with Firebase or just whatever you want to download, and know that you're going to be using that code and refer to whatever that specific website is. And I used a bunch of JavaScript functions through Firebase that were given in the documentation. Like one is called firebase.auth, and I'll explain a lot more on it, but essentially that's the authentication function from the documentation that I primarily used. And I designed the authentication page through Bootstrap, which is a CSS framework, HTML, the coding language, and CSS. And this is essentially all my code. So what all of this is these are the buttons, and you'll see me use something called variables. And what all of these are essentially objects that allow you to manipulate the data through different functions. And as you can see here, I have an email variable, I have a password variable, and all of these are different buttons that I coded. So this is a create new user button, this is a sign in button, this is a logout button, this is my Google button, and all of those connect to that function, which is right here with on-auth state change. So this is the function that I used from Firebase's documentation, and essentially what this function did is it allows Firebase, for example, if you log in, if I log in as cash.c@gmail.com, 1234 password, it communicates to Firebase that the state of the web page, it should be changed, because it should either let me into the app through authentication, or it should give me an error message back. It's saying, oh, the password was wrong, oh, the username was wrong, etc. And as you can, and a lot of this was my main problem at the beginning, because I couldn't get any of it to work. So this is just a little of the code, but everything in green is basically what I had to comment out, what I had to delete in order to make sure that the rest of it would work, and I had to do a lot of that. Okay, so for authentication, this was my initial authentication page, so my initial login page. As you can see, it looked really weird. It had it didn't really contrast well with anything. It was hard to read. It had the email address where you could put in your email. It had the password where you could put in your password, and it had the create new account, sign in with Google, and it had a logout button, which all worked through a bunch of testing. And then so eventually, what I have now is this, which has a field where you can put in your username, which is your email in my case, or your Google email. And then it has your password where you put in your password, and it has these three buttons. And it looks a lot more user-friendly and visually appealing. And this is my actual authentication database on Firebase. And these are just a bunch of test emails that I ran through when I was testing to see if the authentication actually worked in Firebase. So as you can see, john@johns.com, just a bunch of random emails that I kept punching in to see if the sign-in would work, to see if create the new account would work, to see if sign-in through Google would work. And this is the authentication database. Okay, so this is probably this was probably the component of the app that took me the longest time, and it was the hardest to code. So this is the database. So a database is basically where a user's information is stored. So in my case, it's an investment app where it tracks who you are and how much money you have in your investments, what type of investment it is, and it's basically where all of that is stored, where all of that information goes. And I used Firebase real-time database, which is Firebase's own database that you can use, and it's a cloud-hosted database. And for our purposes, a cloud-based database just means fast and efficient. And a real-time database syncs data automatically across all connections, which basically means it syncs data across all devices instantaneously. So through Firebase, I had no need to learn an SQL or query language. And basically what an SQL or query language is those are languages that you use in order to communicate with an actual computer and communicate through a computer to a certain database. And I didn't have to do that because I used Firebase, which took care of all the backend and a bunch of things like this. I used my database functions for authentication in order to store that certain profile, that certain username into the database. I had the database function for all my data entry stuff, which in my case was my investment tracking, like what your name is, what your age range is, what type of investment you have, how much money you have, and all the connecting user profile and investment info. So linking all of my data entry things under your certain authentication, under your certain account. And this was my code for the database. This isn't all of it, but these are just a few functions that I had. So all of this code essentially is what connects my actual, like my components of the investment tracking stuff into the Firebase database. So for example, you can see here I have my name, age, the amount of money invested, the investment type. All of these are thrown into the database, and how my computer linked it to Firebase in order to make sure that when you type in or when you give in whatever information you need to, it gets directly into Firebase and into that database. This was my add profile to database, and what this function does is, as you can see, I have another variable here that says database, and it's the Firebase.database. And I'm calling on Firebase's database function in order to make sure that the profile, the authentication that we talked about, all the usernames, like for example, your whatever email you have, and your whatever password you have, it's thrown into the database. And this is all the code and this is some of the code that puts all of this, so all of your data entry functions, all of your data entry components under this profile, under whatever profile you have, under whatever email you have and password. Okay, so this is my data entry form currently. So as you can, it's a little hard to see. That's something I need to fix. And it has a fill out your profile information. You have your name. You can put in your age range, which I spanned from 18 to 65, and I divided into 5 cohorts through a drop-down menu. And you have the current money you have invested in whatever type of investment. And I have 6 different types of investments: stocks, bonds, EFTs, and cryptocurrencies, and a bunch more. And I have the current asset value here, which is essentially how much your investment is worth right now. And this is my current data entry form. Up here, once you create a new user here, it shows up right up here, where you can either edit it and change whatever aspect you want to. So you want to change your name, you want to change like how much ever you have invested and another investment type, or you can delete it, which deletes it all from the database. So this is just a little snippet of what I actually have on Firebase's real-time database. And as you can see here, I have my user where it gives you an email, and this is all under that certain email. So here it's Kashyap@1234.com. And all of this information is under that certain email, under this certain profile, which is a unique number that Firebase came up with, that I programmed Firebase to identify you with. And here you can see you have your age, you have your current asset value, which I set at 123,000, whatever. Your ID, your investment type, which I set as stocks in this case. Your money invested, which is the same thing. Your name, and then the owner of all of this, which is the unique ID that it gave to me. And this is the data entry in Firebase under each specific profile with the specific user IDs. Okay, so next is the educational aspect of the app. So what I did was I went through 6 types of investments in order to help users gain a solid understanding of what investments are. I went through stocks, bonds, mutual funds, real estate, savings, forex, EFTs, and alternative investments like cryptocurrencies, which are booming right now, and those types of things. I went through different investment strategies and actionable steps, which are essentially, actionable steps are how you get started. So you have to use something called a brokerage in order to start investing in stocks, like apps like Robinhood, M1 Finance, Fidelity, apps that you may have heard of like that. And I've linked to all of them and tell you how exactly to get started and how to use a brokerage. My resources primarily included Investopedia, which I got a lot of my information from. I used Khan Academy, which had a few courses on investments, and which were very helpful. I used a few YouTube channels, some of which are a channel named Andre Jick, Graham Stephan, and various other YouTube channels. And I used a lot of other resources to learn and a lot of other websites which are all cited. And my educational aspect was almost entirely research, as the actual coding part was just throwing it onto the screen through the different scripts I made, because it was basically almost entirely just me typing out what this is, what that is, how to do this, how to do that. Okay, so visualization. This is how you can actually see my app. So this is the front-end framework that I talked about at the beginning. Linking that back to this is the visualization and how a user can actually see, and interact with the app. So this was almost entirely through Bootstrap and CSS code. So CSS is a programming language that's entirely just the visualization of web development. And Bootstrap is just it's a website that gives you a bunch of different code for different components. So for example, through Bootstrap, just some of the things I used were a menu bar from Bootstrap, which was a bunch of pre-written code that I could call upon, and it would throw that up onto my web app, and it made my life a whole lot easier. I used a dark theme, which was just changing the background color. I used modals, which are essentially just floating windows, so when you click on a button, and I used something pops up, and that was through Bootstrap. I used a button through Bootstrap. I used a bunch of things through Bootstrap, and this is Bootstrap's logo right here. And basically, all of my organization and all of my app was through Bootstrap. So this is how my app's homepage looks. That's something I still need to work on. But as you saw, my profile was all of the data entry that you saw a few slides back. The stats is what I'm going to go over in the next slide, which was the Chart.js, which was something that allows you to see your actual data in like visual form. I have all the learn things here, so the intro, actionable steps you can take, the types of investments, the different investment strategies, all of these things. And I have the homepage right here, so if you click this, it redirects you right back to the homepage. So there's a navigation bar. And what I did was I had to connect all of these. So for example, if you wanted to click on my profile and we're currently in the home page, then what I had to do was I had to use something called script tags that read HTML tags that redirected you to that certain page. And I did that through linking that certain page's HTML ID in the code. And yeah, that was basically it for the visualization. Next was Chart.js. So Chart.js is a JavaScript library. So again, it's just a bunch of pre-written code that really helps you. And Chart.js allows for a lot of different types of. Chart.js allows for a lot of different types of graphs and data visualization. So for example, you could have used line graphs, bar graphs, all pie charts, basically any type of chart you could think of, and it had a bunch of interactive graphs too that I'm planning to get into and look into later. And it's really easy to install and use. It took me a bunch of YouTube tutorials to get the hang of it and actually find, and the documentation on Chart.js itself in order to find which components I actually need and how to integrate it into my code. And it was easy to format in code. And this is some of the code that shows what that I used from Chart.js. And this code that's circled in red is how I installed Chart.js through those script tags that I talked about at the beginning. So this was initially how my graph looked like. It was really dark, it was hard to see, and it wouldn't scale. I didn't know how to scale it. and it only had one type of whatever, one type of data point, and yeah, and essentially, and eventually, this is what I got down to. So the red, as you can see here, is the type of stock, and then the green is a type of EFT, and eventually what I got down to by contrasting the colors and making it look visually a lot more appealing. Okay, so some of the main problems I've had with my project, or I've had major problems with authentication. So at the beginning, I really didn't know how to code the authentication, and every time I tried to use the pre-written code from Firebase, from the documentation in Firebase, it wouldn't work out properly at all. And it was just really annoying to get started, and eventually what happened is I started looking online, I couldn't find anything, and then I got thrown into a wormhole about security rules and like cybersecurity and things of that nature, and my dad had to help me tremendously with the authentication part. Then after that was connecting authentication and the database. Now, this was a massive problem because I didn't know how to put that certain profile in the database with whatever data entry. So for example, if I had Challapalli@gmail.com, I didn't know how to put my name, age, stocks, investment type, all of that under that certain profile, and that took a lot of code to get working, which my support advisors helped me with, and my dad eventually did too. And I pieced together those, and I pieced together advice from the internet on how to do it, and things of that nature. And another problem I had was connecting the data entry form with Chart.js. So at the beginning, I figured out how to connect Chart.js with the data entry form so that you could adjust something, or you could update something, or make a new data point, but it wouldn't instantaneously update on my data visualization, on my charts. And it took a lot of code in order to get that working, because what I wanted to eventually do was make sure that whenever you edited something or whenever you deleted something, that line off the graph would be gone. And that's something that I solved eventually, as you saw, but it was annoying at the beginning. Another thing was being short on time and not prioritizing the things I needed to. So like I said earlier, I got thrown into that wormhole on security rules and just a bunch of things like that in general. Whenever I encountered a problem, I got on the internet and looked up a bunch of things. Then I got sucked into something else, and that led me to something else. And eventually things like that happened, and at the end and maybe after a week, I realized that none of that would help me with my app, and it was just a waste of time. And the visual components of the app were initially hard because I didn't know what I wanted to do specifically, and when I did draw it out, it was really annoying getting it centered, getting it like into the specific places of that I wanted to. Okay, so my next steps for the project are hosting, which I should have done by now, but hosting is essentially just throwing the app onto the internet and letting anyone access it. And that won't take much time, and that's something that I'm going to do next. I want to clean up the interface and make it a lot more cleaner, readable, and make it a lot more user-friendly. I want to incorporate basic artificial intelligence algorithms and give users feedback automatically based on what their age group is and what their investment is. So for example, my age group, if I type in my name and my age group, which is like 18 through 24, and if I type in my type of investments, then I want to automatically give you advice on what to do. Like, oh, you're 18 through 24, you're most likely a college student, you're most likely a young adult, here's some advice, here's some things that you should do, and give you a bunch of links and resources on what you want to do, and on what you're advised to do. And I want to get it on mobile devices as well, so you can access it from your phone, from your iPad, from your tablet. And maybe in the educational aspect of things, I want to add quizzes into the app to make sure that it's a lot more user-friendly and people actually know, and people aren't actually like blindly reading it maybe, and people are actually taking it a lot more seriously and make it a lot more interactive that way. And I also want to do much, much more with it that I'm going to eventually plan. Thank you. Yeah, this is my bibliography, and thank you for watching.
Questions?
Right, so when you say that you want to be able to give people feedback based on like their age groups later and perhaps another time, did you also have like an option for like, in terms of when you're giving the information app, like your like, financial situation, like how much income are you making, or is this not going to be accounted for? That's just going to be assumed as an allocation.
So initially what my plan was, like at the beginning of the year, what I wanted to make was I wanted to simulate another Robinhood and make an entire brokerage. Then I quickly decided that that was going to be really hard and I had like no idea how to do that at all. So I was going to incorporate things like that where you could put in what your income was, what your specific financial state was and everything. But I realized that would take a lot of code. I didn't know how to do any of the actual coding behind that. And you would have to specify based on who you are. That's why what I eventually ended up doing was dividing everyone into age groups, and that's why I have advice for specific age groups. If that kind of answers your question.
Your question?
So you mentioned that the lowest age that it was like 18 to 24 or something. I know that some investment apps allow children, not like children, but like teenagers to work alongside with their parents to start investing young. Would you consider making that an option?
Yeah, those are in the next steps. I should have included that, but that's what I'm planning to do. Like maybe an age range below 18 where you can use your parents' like brokerage account, or you can invest through them and their account. Because I know you can have something called a custodial account where you can do it through your parents, and that's a feature that I need to incorporate. So I'm planning to do that for sure.
Yeah, Tom, you got the same question? Any other questions? All right, my man, good job.